A reading from Wealth, Poverty, and Politics. The chapter, Political Factors. The author, the recently retired Thomas Sowell. For fans, he has asked that we frequent his website so that we could see his work in photography. It's one of his favorite hobbies. In the most varied conditions in countries around the world, whether in third world countries or in economically more advanced, advanced countries, and whether in countries where the majority or the minority has the higher skills, those seeking either the leadership or the votes of lagging groups tend to offer them four things. 1. Assurance that their lags are not their fault. Assurance that their lags are the fault of some advanced group that they already envy and resent. Assurance that the lagging group and their culture are just as good as anybody else's, if not better. Assurance that what the lagging group needs and deserves is a demographically defined fair share of the economic and other benefits of society, sometimes supplemented with some kind of reparations for past injustices or some special reward for being indigenous sons of the soil. Economic competition in the marketplace can financially punish those whose beliefs differ from reality. But competition for votes at election time can politically punish people who assert a reality that differs from popular beliefs. In addition, racial or ethnic leaders have every incentive to promote the isolation of the groups they lead, despite the fact that isolation has been a major factor in the poverty and backwardness of many different peoples around the world. Where a lagging group is concentrated in a particular region of a country, leaders of such groups have incentivized to promote secession from the more advanced part of the country, as Slovaks seceded from Czechoslovakia and as East Pakistanis seceded from Pakistan to create the new nation of Bangladesh. Despite the economic losses that poorer groups may sustain, when they are no longer part of a more advanced economy, their political leaders gain from acquiring more power as leaders of a nation, and have every incentive to promote national pride in independent nationhood, whether or not that has made the people they lead better off or worse off economically. The people themselves may also benefit physically by being spared the public embarrassment and private shame of being visibly outperformed repeatedly by others in the same economy and society. Where the political situation makes secession unlikely to happen, leaders of lagging groups have every incentive to promote cultural isolation, such as laws or policies. In parts of the United States requiring the teaching of Hispanic children in the Spanish language, even when their parents want them taught in English, so as to facilitate their rise in the American economy and society. Perhaps the most culturally isolated of all American ethnic groups are those descendants of the indigenous American Indian population who still live on reservations with great legal autonomy, but with lower per capita income than blacks, Hispanics, or other American Indians who are not living on reservations. Since the 1980s, American Indians living off of reservations, who are a substantial majority of all American Indians, have had per capita income slightly higher than those of Hispanic Americans, while American Indians living on reservations have had substantially lower per capita incomes than Black or Hispanic Americans, and less than half that of the American population as a whole. Yet leaders of American Indian reservations jealously guard their prerogatives and promote the perpetuation of separate cultures among the populations of these reservations. Racial or ethnic leaders also have incentives to blame advanced groups for the lags of lagging groups. The behavior of advanced groups toward lagging groups has by no means always been exemplary, nor necessarily even decent, so the leaders of lagging groups may have many things to complain about, without those things necessarily being the reasons for the economic, educational, or other gaps between the advanced groups and the lagging groups. In particular circumstances, some advanced group may in fact be the cause of holding back some lagging group, but that cannot be assumed a priori from the fact that one group is demonstrably more successful economically or in other ways. Even where the advanced group has behaved badly toward the lagging groups, as has often happened in many countries around the world, that is still not proof that the lagging group would have been better off economically in the absence of the advanced group. The ancient Romans certainly behaved abominably toward the ancient Britons, whom they conquered, but that is not to say that the Romans were the reason the Britons lagged. It was only the fact that the Britons lagged before the Romans arrived and conquered them that permitted a numerically smaller Roman military force to overwhelm a numerically larger British force, both during the conquest and later, when there was a mass uprising of the British provoked by the Romans' oppression. In putting down that uprising, the Romans slaughtered Britons by the thousands, and the queen, who had led the uprising, committed suicide to avoid the retribution she knew she could expect from the Romans. Yet in modern times, even a British patriot as Winston Churchill could say, "We owe London to Rome," because the ancient Britons were not yet capable of creating such a city themselves. No one believes that slaves were always treated well in the many times and places around the world where there were slaves. There is too much documented evidence that they were not. But the fact that Black Americans today have a far higher standard of living than the peoples of sub-Saharan Africa from which they are descended is not a happenstance, nor can this outcome retroactively justify slavery any more than the valuable advantages that Western Europeans' descendants received as a cultural legacy from Roman conquests can retroactively justify the Romans' brutal oppression of their ancestors. Neither can individuals or groups lagging today automatically blame their lags on the injustices inflicted on their ancestors, when the cultural benefits available to them in later times were an unintended byproduct of those injustices. Moral condemnation is not causal explanation, despite how often the two have been combined in a politically attractive package. Despite the tendency of political and especially ideological explanations of economic disparities to combine moral and causal factors, the reason so many mountain peoples around the world have been poor has not been that others went up into those mountains and took away their wealth, but that the mountain peoples seldom produced much wealth in the first place. The Spaniards seizing the wealth of the Incas was an exception on a horrific scale, but empirically, it was not the rule. The one thing that can be said unequivocally about the past is that it is irrevocable. When both history and the contemporary world scene show what a challenge it can be to create or maintain decent relations among contemporaries, it is staggering that some people imagine that they can take on the far larger task of righting the wrongs of the past, committed by people long dead, without igniting dangerous new hostilities among the living. The welfare state. The welfare state is often seen in terms of its effects on the material well-being of individuals or groups. However, it can also have an effect on the productivity of a nation as a whole, and therefore on the standard of living of its people in general. Moreover, the welfare state's effects extend beyond economics to social behavior, with major impacts on both the recipients of welfare benefits and those who interact with them. These effects are not due solely to the welfare state as much as such, but often to the social vision that accompanies the welfare state and changes the way many people see the world. The welfare state vision. In a democratic country, a welfare state can be created only after a welfare state vision is created and prevails politically. Therefore, in assessing the effect of a welfare state, we must include the effects of that vision as well as the effects of the particular institutions and policies created. Among the assumptions behind the welfare state vision, two seem crucial. One, many people are mired in a degree of poverty that a prosperous society can and should relieve. And two, many, if not most, of the people in poverty never had the same chance of a better life as others who ended up more prosperous. Even in a society with rules that are fair in the sense of judging everyone by the same standards and rewarding or punishing them according to the same criteria, it would still be true that someone born in the South Bronx would have nothing like the same probability of achieving economic success, however defined, as someone born in an elegant Park Avenue neighborhood. To be fair, in the sense of providing equal probabilities of success for people born in unequal social circumstances, would be very different. In that sense, life has been unfair in virtually every society of the past or the present. The case for the welfare state vision has seldom been made more clearly than by Nicholas Kristof of the New York Times. From Nicholas Kristof, one delusion common among America's successful people is that they triumphed just because of hard work and intelligence. In fact, their big break came when they were conceived in middle-class American families who loved them, read them stories, and nurtured them with little league sports, library cards, and music lessons. They were programmed for success by the time they were zygotes. The social conditions into which individuals are born and raised are, of course, not equal, just as the geographic, demographic, and cultural conditions in which individuals, groups, and nations find themselves are not equal in their economic prospects. This has been true throughout recorded history. No doubt many of us wish that things were different, and some want to do something about it, but everything depends on just what specifically is the something that is done. The welfare state is just one option among many. Mr. Kristof's response to the unfairness of life is to criticize those, quote, who are oblivious of their own advantages and of other people's disadvantages, unquote. He accused them of, quote, a mean-spiritedness in the political world or, at best, a lack of empathy toward those struggling, partly explaining the hostility to state expansion of Medicaid, to long-term unemployment benefits, or to raising the minimum wage to keep up with inflation, unquote. In short, Kristof's response to the unfairness of life is a government transfer of resources from those who are more prosperous to those who are less prosperous, with no caveats about the further consequences of such welfare state policies, or its accompanying vision, and no apparent apprehension about whether those consequences will make either the less prosperous or society at large better off or worse off on net balance. To blithely assume that the only reason to be against minimum wage laws is a lack of empathy with the poor is to ignore a vast literature on the negative repercussions of minimum wage laws. These repercussions include increased numbers of unemployed young males idle on the streets, which is seldom a benefit to any community. 10 years after the passage of the federal minimum wage law in the United States, the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938, the wartime inflation in the intervening years had so raised prices and wages that the minimum wage specified in that law was below what inexperienced and unskilled workers were already being paid, so that by 1948, the economic situation in most places was the same as if there were no minimum wage law. The unemployment rate among black 16 and 17-year-olds that year was just under 10%. But in later years, as the minimum wage was repeatedly raised to keep up with inflation, unemployment among blacks this age never again fell below 20%. It was 27% a decade later in 1958 and 45% in 1975. It is one of the most elementary principles of economics that prices artificially raised above the level set by supply and demand create unsaleable surpluses whether that what is being sold is agricultural produce or labor, regardless of the presence or absence of empathy. Despite a common claim advanced by Christoph, among many others, that, quote, slavery and post slavery oppression left a legacy of broken families among blacks, the plain fact is that the proportion of black children living with only one parent was never as large during the first 100 years after slavery as it became in the first 30 years after the great expansion of the welfare state beginning in the 1960s. Yet the, quote, legacy of slavery, unquote, argument continues to be blithely repeated and the legacy of the welfare state ignored. The proportion of black children being raised by a single mother in 1960 was 22%. 35 years later, that proportion had risen to 52% being raised by a mother alone, 4% being raised by a father alone, and another 11% being raised with neither parent present. Altogether, 67% of all black children. By 1995, the proportion of black children in poverty-level families who were being raised without a father present was 85%. The central rationale for the welfare state is poverty. But if the word is to have any specific meaning, someone must define its specific terms. Once that is done, poverty means no more and no less than those specifications. However much the word may conjure up images of a past era when poverty meant hunger, ragged clothing, cramped housing, and the like. Today, poverty in America means whatever government statisticians in Washington say it means, and they are unlikely to define it in ways that would jeopardize the welfare state of which they are a part. Most people living below the official poverty line in the United States in 2001 had central air conditioning and a microwave oven, for example. In fact, these items were more common among the officially poor in 2001 than they were among the American population as a whole. In 1980. Most poverty-level households in 2001 had cable television and 2 or more television sets. As of 2003, nearly 3/4 of officially poverty-level households owned at least one motor vehicle, and 14% owned 2 or more. In contrast to times past when low-income people lived in overcrowded dwellings, Americans living below the official poverty level today have more housing space per person than the average European. Not poor Europeans, but the average European. As a scholar who spent years studying Latin America put it, the poverty line in the United States is the upper middle class in Mexico. This is not to say that Americans living in official poverty have no problems. They have serious and often catastrophic social problems. But these are seldom the result of material deprivation and are far more often a result of social degeneration, much of it representing social retrogressions during the era of the rising welfare state and of the professive, non-judgmental welfare state ideology. The next part is coming later, and that's going to crush it. Ta-ta. Music provided by Yoko Kanno. The official soundtrack of Ghost in the Shell 2, Innocence Lost.